The courtroom fell silent the moment my mother walked in. Not to save my brother, but to reveal I was the real mastermind, and that the federal agents currently dragging her out were working for the very network I was supposed to expose. The silence in the courtroom was thick enough to chew on, the kind that settles only when the air pressure drops before a massive storm. I could feel every single set of eyes in that gallery fixed on me, but my own vision was laser-focused on the man sitting across the aisle, my brother, Mark. He was slumped over, looking less like the ambitious executive I remembered, and more like a scarecrow stuffed with bad decisions. It had taken 3 years for us to get to this precise moment. 3 years since the initial raid. 3 years of agonizing police interviews. 3 years of watching our family fracture under the weight of the accusations. And now, it was down to the final testimony before the judge retired to deliberate on the verdict for the massive fraud charges, the accusations that had nearly bankrupted 3 major investment firms and implicated half the city council. My name is Alex. I was the whistleblower. I was the one who found the ledgers, the offshore accounts, the whole meticulously planned, utterly illegal operation Mark had orchestrated under the facade of his legitimate tech startup. And I was the one who walked into the office of the Service of Internal Security with enough evidence to bring down an entire shadowy network. Mr. Harrison, the prosecutor began, his voice slick and overly calm. You have testified that your brother Mark was the principal architect of this complex financial scheme, correct? I swallowed, my throat dry. Yes, sir, he was. And yet, despite presenting evidence that suggests misappropriation of hundreds of millions, you still maintain that your relationship with your mother, Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, remains unaffected by these revelations? This was the knife twist. Always the mother. Eleanor Harrison was a local legend, a philanthropist, a pillar of the community, a woman whose charity galas were spoken of in reverent whispers. Mark had used her reputation as his ultimate shield. The defense team had argued for weeks that Mark was merely a misguided pawn, manipulated by his doting yet naive mother, who supposedly signed documents without understanding their implications. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. My mother, she always protected him, fiercely. The prosecutor leaned in conspiratorially toward the jury. Protected him, Mr. Harrison? Or actively participated in securing the legitimacy of the funds through her extensive network? She didn't know the extent of it, I insisted, gripping the wooden railing of the witness stand. She provided the initial seed money for the shell company, yes, claiming it was for a social impact project. But she never saw the final schematics. She didn't understand the scale of the heavy lifting required to move that volume of money. That's when Mark snapped. He shot up from his chair, his expensive suit rumpled, his face contorted into something unrecognizable. The bailiff immediately moved to restrain him, but not before the entire room was subjected to his outburst. "Stop complaining! My mother can do no wrong," he yelled, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You're trying to destroy her reputation because you can't stand that I succeeded where you failed, Alex. You were always jealous." The judge banged the gavel twice, a sharp, commanding sound. "Mr. Harrison, take your seat immediately, or you will be held in contempt." Mark sank back down, breathing heavily, shooting me a look of pure, venomous hatred. The prosecutor allowed a beat of silence to stretch, letting the jury absorb the scene. The desperate loyalty, the implication of a conspiracy, the raw family breakdown. "Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Harrison," the prosecutor said smoothly, addressing me once more. "Let's return to the evidence. Specifically, this email chain, recovered from a secured server that the defense claims was fabricated by your brother." He tapped a folder on the table. "It details quite clearly Mrs. Harrison instructing an intermediary on how to sanitize the source funds for the initial overseas transfer, using language that suggests a deep understanding of money laundering techniques. Do you recognize this language?" I looked at the enlarged projection on the wall. It was damning. My mother's familiar sign-off, EH, was clearly visible at the bottom of the message chain, discussing shell corporations registered in obscure island nations. "That," I started, my voice failing me. I had spent months looking for proof of her direct involvement, but I had only found circumstantial evidence, bank statements showing large, untraceable gifts to Mark over the years. This was concrete. This was the final nail. It looks like her correspondence, I admitted weakly. The prosecutor smiled, a slow, terrible unfolding of victory. Indeed. And now, Mr. Harrison, the defense has brought forward a surprise witness to rebut your entire testimony, someone who claims you were not the mastermind, but merely the desperate assistant, following the direct orders of the true leader. A leader, Mr. Harrison, who is prepared to testify that she fully controlled this entire organized scheme. My heart plummeted into my stomach. I looked over at the courtroom door, waiting for the defense counsel to usher in their final, devastating witness. The door swung open slowly, creaking dramatically, and there she was, my mother. Eleanor Harrison walked in, not looking frail or manipulated, but radiating a cold, steely control I had never witnessed before. She didn't look at Mark. She didn't even glance at me. She walked directly to the stand reserved for prosecution witnesses, took the oath with a steady hand, and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she stated, her voice ringing clear and strong, "my son Mark is innocent. I orchestrated every aspect of the financial restructuring, and I will tell you exactly how Alec helped me cover the whole thing up." The air was sucked out of the room again, but this time it wasn't from tension. It was from utter, staggering disbelief. My mother, Eleanor Harrison, seated where witnesses for the prosecution, or at least the truth usually sat, looked less like a repentant matriarch and more like a general surveying a battlefield she was about to conquer. I couldn't breathe. I stared at her, searching for the slightest flicker of irony, the hint that this was some elaborate last-ditch defense maneuver. There was nothing, just the sharp, assessing gaze of a woman who had just decided to burn everything down to save only what mattered to her. The judge, clearly blindsided, adjusted his glasses nervously. "Mrs. Harrison, you are aware you are under oath, and that this testimony directly contradicts the established defense narrative, which claimed you were unaware of the details." "I am aware, Your Honor," she replied, her tone utterly devoid of warmth. "I am also aware that my two sons are currently entangled in a severe legal situation stemming from accusations of a massive financial conspiracy. I have decided it is time for one of them to walk free." The prosecutor, regaining his footing with surprising speed, leaped to his feet. "Your Honor, the prosecution would welcome Mrs. Harrison's testimony, provided she is willing to detail her role, including the communications regarding the offshore transfers we previously entered into evidence." My mother didn't look at the prosecutor. She looked only at me. "I will detail everything," she confirmed. "But first, I want to be very clear about Alex's involvement." This was worse than I could have imagined. I had blown the whistle, trying to preserve whatever shred of decency was left in our family, protecting myself from the inevitable fallout when the authorities inevitably traced the money back to the source. Now, my own mother was offering herself up as the sole architect, but only to throw me under the bus as her willing accomplice. "Alex was not just an assistant, Your Honor," she continued, her voice hardening. "He was my architect. He was the one who coded the encryption algorithms that disguised the transaction logs. He was the one who set up the dummy corporations in the Caymans using his own college pseudonym. He initiated contact with the network of criminals involved in moving the assets, the group that specialized in circumventing international sanctions. He was deep in this organized scheme from the beginning." Mark, across the room, looked up, a strange mix of relief and confusion warring on his face. He mouthed something that looked like, "What are you doing?" I stood up instinctively, my hands slamming against the witness stand. "That's a lie! She's lying! I found the evidence. I brought it to the Service of Internal Security. I was trying to clean up his mess, Mark's mess." The judge banged the gavel again, louder this time. "Mr. Harrison, sit down. This is your mother's testimony now." "She's rewriting history," I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. "She's protecting Mark. She always protects him." Eleanor paused, letting my outburst hang in the air. Then she delivered the blow, delivered directly to the jury box, ignoring the chaos I was causing. "Alex, my dear boy," she said, her voice dropping to a sickeningly sweet register, "you never understood business. You always saw everything in black and white. When you discovered the initial irregularities, the very small, very necessary adjustments I had to make to save your father's failing legacy, you panicked. You thought you could play hero. She leaned forward, her eyes glittering under the harsh courtroom lights. "But you didn't bring this evidence to the authorities to clear your conscience, Alex. You brought it because I told you to. I needed an in-house scapegoat who could look like a whistleblower while simultaneously burying the deeper connections. You did exactly what I planned. You took the heat for the initial findings, which involved only minor figures, the ones handling the paperwork for the distribution of forbidden substances the network was using for leverage." I felt physically ill. The mention of the forbidden substances, a separate, terrifying aspect of the network's activities that I had deliberately kept separate from the fraud investigation, was horrifyingly specific. I hadn't known my mother was connected to that trade at all. I thought I was dealing with white-collar crime. "The fraud charges are substantial," the judge interjected, trying to regain control. "Mrs. Harrison, are you stating that your son, Alex, actively participated in the fraud scheme, or that he was manipulated into reporting a smaller, separate aspect of the overall operation?" "He was the primary technical operator for the entire enterprise, Your Honor," she stated calmly. "The fraud was my idea, but the execution, the system that hid everything, was Alex's programming genius. And Mark? Mark was simply my figurehead, the public face. I ensured Mark would look guilty of the less serious offenses, giving Alex the illusion of heroism when he discovered the trail." She paused, letting the weight of this confession settle. Then she raised her hand and slowly, deliberately, pulled down the cuff of her perfectly tailored silk blouse, revealing something I had never seen before. Tucked just beneath her wrist, half hidden by the fabric, was a thin, dark, metallic cuff attached to a heavy chain that disappeared under the witness stand. "But you see, Your Honor," she concluded, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried across the entire room, "I have a complication you should all be made aware of. Alex wasn't just working for me. He was also working for the people who wanted to bring down the entire network, including me. I only managed to locate and secure some of the physical evidence Alex had hidden before the raid, evidence that proves the Service of Internal Security has been compromised at the very highest levels, possibly as far back as 10 years. And I didn't just find the evidence Alex collected. I found the evidence that proves Alex was planning to trade that information for a full immunity deal for himself and a life sentence for Mark." The bailiff's hand snapped to the weapon at his side. My mother glanced down at the cuff again, a grim satisfaction on her face. "This," she said, tapping the metal on her wrist, "is a tracker. I didn't come here freely, Your Honor. I was brought here under duress by the operatives Alex contacted, and if I reveal their names or the scope of the evidence concerning the compromised officials, I'm afraid I won't make it out of this courtroom alive, and neither will Mark." Alex's deal was supposed to eliminate both of us quietly after the verdict. The revelation that my mother was wearing a tracking device, ostensibly placed by the very authorities I believed I was working with, paralyzed the courtroom. The silence this time wasn't merely thick, it was toxic, laced with the scent of betrayal from every direction. The judge stared down at Eleanor Harrison, his face a mask of shock, while the prosecutor looked utterly bewildered, glancing back at the security officers posted near the doors. "Mrs. Harrison," the judge managed, his voice strained, "I must ask you to clarify. Are you claiming that you are currently being held against your will and that this device is—" "A failsafe, Your Honor," Eleanor cut in, her eyes sweeping over the room, settling momentarily on the security detail. "Alex promised me protection if I took the blame for the initial, smaller financial manipulations, allowing him to look like the hero who exposed the corrupt elements. He was supposed to secure Mark's freedom in exchange for turning over evidence detailing a vast, compromised network within the Service of Internal Security, a network far larger than just simple fraud." She tugged slightly on the cuff, making the metal gleam. I agreed, foolishly believing Alex had the upper hand. But Alex's true allegiance was never to family or justice. It was to self-preservation. He handed over doctored evidence to make himself look like a crusader, while setting up a contingency plan, a deep ledger, to sell out the real players, including those in high office, for a clean slate and a massive payout. He planned to sacrifice Mark, then sell the real story for his own gain. I felt the world tilt. Everything I thought I was doing, the desperate, painful choice to expose the rot, was being twisted into a calculated, cynical power play. I had gone to the authorities because Mark was destroying us. And yes, I was terrified of the larger ramifications of the network, especially after learning about the movement of those dangerous, prohibited packages. But I had believed that turning over the core fraud evidence would force an honest investigation into everything else. That ledger, Your Honor, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength, is not in the evidence locker where Alex claimed to have submitted everything. It's hidden, and I know where it is. It's the key to uncovering the true scale of this operation and the extent of the infiltration into the legal system, including some individuals in this very courthouse. The prosecutor finally found his voice, his professional demeanor entirely shattered. Your Honor, we must adjourn immediately. This witness has just implicated elements of this investigation itself. We need to verify her claims about this device and the hidden evidence. Adjourn? Eleanor scoffed. That's precisely what the agents who brought me here want. Time to move the ledger and silence me permanently. Alex's deal stipulated that once I was discredited or neutralized, the case would proceed swiftly, with Mark taking the fall for the fraud and Alex walking away with a clean record, lauded as the one who cleaned up the smaller mess. She fixed her gaze on me, a look of profound disappointment mingled with something that chilled me to the bone: pity. Alex, you were always too ambitious for your own good. You tried to play all sides, and now you've trapped us all. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery burst open, not with the measured steps of court security, but with the loud, chaotic intrusion of uniformed personnel who were clearly not part of the standard court detail. They moved with a frightening, practiced coordination, their faces grim and unreadable. They weren't local police. Their gear looked tactical. "They're here," Eleanor whispered, her hand instinctively going to the cuff again, though it seemed useless against this level of brute force intervention. The cleanup crew. One of the lead figures, a man whose insignia I didn't recognize, barked an order. "Nobody moves. This hearing is suspended under federal jurisdiction regarding ongoing counterintelligence operations." Panic erupted. People screamed, scrambling away from the well of the court. Mark was frozen. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, but the sound was drowned out by the shouting and the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots on marble. The tactical team ignored the judge and moved straight toward the witness stand. 2 officers flanked my mother. "Mrs. Harrison," the lead operative said, his voice dangerously low, "we need you to come with us now. Do not resist." "You work for the people Alex was selling the ledger to, don't you?" Eleanor challenged, standing her ground even as the others tried to pull her down. "You're not here to protect me. You're here to seize the evidence and eliminate the loose ends. Tell me, is Judge Thompson on your payroll too?" The operative didn't answer. Instead, he looked past my mother, directly at me, standing rigid in the witness box. He lifted his hand, and resting in his palm was a small, dull gray device, a specialized electronic jammer. "Alex Harrison," the operative stated, his voice carrying chilling clarity over the chaos. "You are under arrest for accessory to large-scale organized financial crime, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and for the attempted framing of a federal informant. The deal is off." He raised the jammer, aiming it directly at my mother's wrist. A high-pitched whine pierced the air, and Eleanor cried out, clutching her arm just as the tactical team pulled her violently from the stand. They dragged her toward a side door that clearly led out of the main courthouse structure. "The ledger, Alex," she screamed back at me, her face twisted in pain and fury as she was hauled away. "It's behind the portrait of the city founder in your old study. If you don't get it first, they'll use it to bury us all. They're coming for you next." The door slammed shut behind them, leaving me alone in the witness box, the courtroom emptying rapidly, the sound of distant sirens wailing, and the horrific realization dawning that my mother wasn't lying about the depth of the conspiracy, and that the man I thought was my only ally had just declared me his primary target. I had minutes, maybe less, before the other side realized I was the one who held the key to everything. The sheer speed of the operation was breathtaking. 1 minute, I was listening to my mother reveal a conspiracy that implicated the highest levels of security and law enforcement. The next, she was gone, dragged out by men who looked less like police and more like operatives from a clandestine foreign agency. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the frantic whispers of the few remaining court clerks trying to secure the building. I didn't wait for the officers who were supposed to arrest me to finish processing the chaos. My mother's final words, "The ledger, behind the portrait, in your old study," were a command etched in fire. My old study, the house Mark and I grew up in, the house I had moved out of 6 months ago when the pressure became too much, but a house that still held my private affairs, things I thought were long secured. I leaped from the witness stand, knocking over the railing with a crash that didn't even register in my panic. The prosecutor was already on his phone, shouting hushed, panicked instructions to someone named Jenkins. I didn't look back. I bolted for the side exit usually reserved for counsel, shoving past a flustered security guard who looked utterly lost about which directive to follow next. The parking garage was cool and damp. I sprinted to my car, a nondescript sedan I deliberately kept outside the scrutiny of both my family's and the authorities' surveillance radars. Keys fumbling, I jammed the ignition, my mind racing through the implications. If the tactical team worked for the compromised faction, the one Alex had supposedly been working against, then they knew my every move, perhaps even my destination, soon enough. The drive across the city was a blur of adrenaline and near misses. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, I scanned for the dark, unmarked vehicles that signaled the operatives. My mother had confirmed my worst fear. I hadn't been a whistleblower. I had been a pawn in a complex game of corporate and governmental espionage. I had thought I was exposing fraud. I had actually been setting up Mark as a diversion while I secured the real power, the ledger detailing the compromise of the Service of Internal Security. When I reached the familiar, imposing facade of our childhood home, it looked deceptively peaceful. Porch lights on, not a soul in sight. I bypassed the front door, too risky, likely wired or monitored, and went around to the overgrown side entrance leading to the old library, my study. The lock was surprisingly easy to pick. Years of knowing exactly where Dad kept the spare key for emergencies paid off one last time. I slipped inside, the air musty, the house feeling strangely vacant without the constant tension of the past few years. The study. It was exactly as I left it. Mahogany desk, leather-bound books that served no purpose other than decoration, and dominating the far wall, the massive gilded portrait of Governor Silas Thorne, the city's revered, long-dead founder. I didn't waste time admiring the view. I knew the mechanism my mother referenced, a small, almost invisible latch hidden in the frame, accessible only by pressing two specific points on the carved laurel leaves simultaneously. My fingers, surprisingly steady now that I was actively pursuing the objective, found the spot. Click. The heavy portrait swung inward with a slow, grating sound, revealing a small, reinforced safe tucked into the plaster wall. This wasn't a standard safe. It was military grade, designed to withstand extreme heat and impact. I had built it myself years ago during a paranoid phase after securing my first big contract, ensuring only I knew the combination. I punched in the sequence, my father's birth year, my first programming language's version number, and the date I first met Mark. The tumblers clicked heavily. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside there was no cash, no jewelry, just a single, slim, military-grade solid-state drive nestled in black velvet. The ledger. The real ledger. It contained every transaction, every coded communication, every name of the compromised agents, every single detail of the ongoing operation that my mother had inadvertently protected by keeping me close for so long. I snatched the drive. It felt warm in my palm, humming with the weight of 1,000 secrets. As I turned to leave, a voice sliced through the silence, not panicked like the court, not commanding like the operatives, but familiar, dangerously smooth, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Leaving so soon, Alex?" Standing in the doorway to the study, silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway, was the prosecutor. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit anymore. He was dressed in dark tactical gear, identical to the men who had dragged my mother away, only he lacked the helmet. He held a silenced weapon pointed directly at my chest. "You've been a useful asset, Alex," he continued, taking a slow step into the room. "But your mother, bless her loyalty, just made a critical error. We needed the ledger, yes, but we needed you alive to verify its integrity before we could move the assets and eliminate the final loose ends. Now that you've delivered it directly to me, you've made things incredibly simple." He smiled, and it was the same chilling smile he'd worn when I first walked into the prosecutor's office 3 years ago, believing I was walking in to start the process of finding justice. "You should have just taken the plea deal for the minor fraud, Alex. Now you get the full weight of everything." The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by the faint mechanical sigh of the door mechanism locking behind the prosecutor. He stood there, no longer the slick legal shark, but the predator he truly was, the central figure in the compromised network, the architect of the cover-up, the one who had been pulling every string, including mine and Mark's. "You orchestrated the entire thing," I managed, my voice a raw whisper, my fingers instinctively tightening around the SSD drive in my hand. The fraud charges against Mark, my initial report to the Service of Internal Security, it was all to force my hand, to make me look like the hero who exposed your petty rivals. "Petty rivals?" he chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Alex, my dear boy, your mother was naive enough to think she could play the martyr and save your brother from a moderate term. You, however, were brilliant enough to think you could use the initial investigation as leverage to expose my operation and walk away clean." He gestured with the weapon toward the portrait. "Hand over the ledger. I'll handle your arrest myself. It will look tidier this way. A confession of guilt, a clean transfer of critical intelligence, and a quiet disappearance." My mind raced, calculating odds. I couldn't outrun him. He was armed, I was cornered, and the whole house was now compromised by his team. But I had one advantage that even my mother's desperate gambit hadn't accounted for. I hadn't just secured the primary ledger. "You think this is the only copy?" I asked, forcing a look of defeat onto my face. He hesitated, a fraction of a second of pure doubt crossing his eyes. "Don't play games, Harrison. We know everything you created." "No," I countered, taking a slow, deliberate step back toward the wall, pretending to brace myself against the sudden surge of adrenaline. "I learned a long time ago, when dealing with people like you, the real power brokers, you never trust one path or one piece of evidence." I knew the tactical team was sweeping the grounds outside, securing the perimeter and looking for the operatives who had just taken my mother. They wouldn't find them. They were already gone, likely rerouted by the prosecutor to secure the actual evidence cache my mother had intended to reveal. But they hadn't secured the house yet. As he shifted his aim, adjusting for my subtle movement, I slammed my elbow back against the wall, not on the latch this time, but on a loose section of plaster just beneath the safe. The small structural damage was enough. A tiny, almost inaudible whir sounded from deep within the wall. "What was that?" the prosecutor demanded, his composure finally cracking. "That," I said, my voice suddenly strong, infused with the cold certainty of a programmer who has just deployed a final, irreversible patch, was the secondary failsafe on the house's entire smart system. "Remember how I told you I built the security for this place? I also built the fire suppression override." The prosecutor's eyes widened in horror as a faint, acrid smell began to permeate the air, not smoke, but the sharp chemical odor of high-grade halon gas. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed, leveling the weapon again. "You'll asphyxiate both of us, and you'll destroy the ledger." "Not the ledger," I corrected, holding up the drive protectively. "The gas is designed to starve the air of oxygen in exactly 60 seconds, which preserves electronics perfectly. It's designed to neutralize hostile intruders who breach a high-value asset location without the proper biometric clearance, which, apparently, you bypassed with that ridiculous team you brought in." He lunged forward, but he was too slow, too focused on the gun. In that split second, I activated the real weapon, a tiny subcutaneous RFID chip embedded in my own wrist, the one I'd installed right after I first went to the Service of Internal Security, just in case I was double-crossed. I slammed my wrist hard against the metal frame of the open safe. A massive surge of energy ripped through the room, not fire, but a focused, directed electromagnetic pulse, a localized EMP that fried every piece of unsecured electronic equipment in a 5-foot radius. The prosecutor cried out as his silenced weapon sputtered, locking up entirely, the internal firing mechanism fused into slag. Simultaneously, the halon gas system, which relied on wireless relay to maintain pressure, suddenly cycled into full emergency blast mode. The room instantly filled with the heavy, suffocating cloud. I pressed my face into the velvet lining of the now empty safe compartment, shielding the SSD drive against my chest, holding my breath. I watched through the dissipating haze as the prosecutor clawed at his own throat, stumbling blindly. He was trapped, neutralized by his own assumption that I was just the naive programmer. I gave him 10 seconds of the gas, enough to render him unconscious and ensure his team outside couldn't breach the specialized, pressurized gas barrier without risking their own lives. Then, I hit the manual override sequence on the chip in my wrist. The gas flow ceased, replaced by fresh, slightly chilled air flooding back into the room. When I stepped out, breathing deeply, the prosecutor was slumped against the wall, his tactical gear useless against the environment I had controlled. I didn't call the compromised officials. I didn't call the local police. I called a number I had memorized years ago, an old contact from the Service of Internal Security. Someone clean, someone I had kept off the primary ledger. "It's Alex Harrison," I said into the phone, my voice finally steady. "I have the primary ledger, and I have the architect of the infiltration, the lead prosecutor, unconscious in my study. My mother is alive, being held by his people. You need to move now. I need extraction, immunity for Mark for the minor charges, and full protection for Eleanor. In return, you get everything you need to clean house." I looked down at the drive. It was heavy, but the weight was gone. I hadn't won by playing the hero or the villain. I won by being the better strategist. The game was over. The ledger was safe. Now we could finally start tearing down the true power structure that had haunted our family for years.